The rain hammered against the windows of the Smithsonian Institution's photographic archive in Washington, D.C. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a 38-year-old historian specializing in Appalachian culture, had spent the last 6 hours surrounded by cardboard boxes filled with 19th-century photographs. Her eyes burned from examining countless faded images under the magnifying lamp, but she couldn't stop now. This collection, recently donated by the estate of a deceased collector, represented an untapped window into mountain life during America's industrial transformation. Sarah pushed her reading glasses up the bridge of her nose and reached for another envelope. The label read, Appalachian Schools, 1880s to 1890s. Inside were dozens of photographs showing one-room schoolhouses, stern-faced teachers, and children in worn clothing. These images always moved her. The Appalachian region during that era was isolated, impoverished, yet filled with resilient communities that valued education despite overwhelming poverty. She carefully lifted each photograph, noting the details in her laptop. Then she saw it. A larger image, mounted on thick cardboard backing. The photograph showed approximately 30 children and one teacher standing in front of a weathered wooden schoolhouse. The mountains rose dramatically behind them, their peaks sharp against a bright sky. The children smiled broadly, some holding slates, others with their arms around each other's shoulders. It appeared to be a joyful moment captured in time. But something felt wrong. Sarah leaned closer. The shadows. Every single shadow cast by the children fell toward the right side of the photograph. Yet the shadow of the schoolhouse behind them stretched distinctly to the left. The teacher's shadow also pointed left, contradicting the children's shadows entirely. It was as if two different light sources had illuminated the scene simultaneously, which was physically impossible in outdoor daylight photography of that era. Her heart raced. In 15 years of studying historical photographs, she had never encountered anything quite like this. Sarah flipped the mounting board over. Written in faded ink was a brief inscription, Pine Ridge School with County, Virginia. October 1890. Photographer, Elijah Thorne. She immediately photographed the image with her phone and began searching the Smithsonian's digital database for any mention of Elijah Thorne. Nothing appeared. She expanded her search to include university archives, historical societies, and genealogical records. After an hour, she found a single reference, a brief mention in a book about Appalachian photographers published in 1967. According to the text, Elijah Thorne was an itinerant photographer who traveled through Virginia's mountain communities between 1888 and 1891, but his work had largely disappeared from the historical record. Sarah saved the photograph's digital file and began composing an email to her colleague, Dr. Marcus Reynolds, a photographic forensics expert at Georgetown University. Marcus had helped her authenticate questionable images before, using modern technology to analyze everything from paper composition to silver particle distribution in old photographs. If anyone could explain the shadow anomaly, it would be him. The next morning, Sarah drove through the heavy Washington traffic to Marcus's laboratory on the Georgetown campus. She found him in his usual spot, hunched over a computer screen displaying a magnified section of a Civil War-era photograph. Marcus was 52, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses that constantly slipped down his nose. He had dedicated his career to understanding the technical aspects of 19th-century photography, and his expertise had exposed numerous forgeries while authenticating previously disputed historical images. "Sarah, come look at this," Marcus said without looking up from his screen. This photograph supposedly shows Lincoln's second inauguration, but the pixel degradation pattern suggests it was digitally altered sometime in the 1990s. Probably someone trying to create a valuable, lost image to sell to collectors. "I think I've found something that might interest you more," Sarah replied, pulling up the Pine Ridge School photograph on her laptop. "Look at the shadows." Marcus wheeled his chair over and studied the image for several seconds. His eyebrows rose slowly. "That's extraordinary. The inconsistency is obvious once you notice it. Where did you find this?" "Smithsonian donation. Estate collection. The photographer was someone named Elijah Thorne, but I can't find much information about him. The image is dated October 1890, from a place called Pine Ridge School in Wythe County, Virginia. Marcus downloaded the file and opened it in his forensic imaging software. He began analyzing the photograph's composition, examining the grain structure, the tonal range, and the distribution of light and shadow across the image. The photograph itself appears authentic to the period, he said after several minutes. The paper stock is consistent with 1890s albumin prints. The chemical composition of the emulsion matches what we'd expect from that era. There's no evidence of digital manipulation, obviously, and the physical degradation patterns are consistent with genuine aging. So it's not a modern forgery, Sarah confirmed. Definitely not. But that doesn't explain the shadows. Marcus zoomed in on different sections of the image, switching between various analytical views. In outdoor photography, especially in 1890, you only had one light source, the sun. Artificial lighting powerful enough to affect shadows simply didn't exist for outdoor use. Yet here we have shadows falling in two distinctly different directions. Could it be a double exposure? Sarah asked. That was my first thought, but look here. Marcus pointed to the edges where children stood close together. If this were a double exposure, you'd see ghosting, blurred edges, or overlap inconsistencies. But every child is sharply defined with no transparency effects. Additionally, the ground surface is continuous across the entire image. In a double exposure combining different photographs, you'd see discontinuities in the terrain, especially given the uneven ground typical of mountain schoolyards. Sarah felt both excitement and frustration building. Then what are we looking at? Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. I need to run more tests. Can you leave the original photograph with me for a few days? I want to examine it under different wavelengths of light, analyze the silver particle distribution more carefully, and consult with a colleague who specializes in Victorian photographic techniques. Of course, I'm going to start researching the location and the people involved. Maybe understanding the context will help explain the technical mystery. Over the next week, Sarah dove deep into researching Wythe County, Virginia, and its history during the 1890s. The county sat in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, a region that had struggled economically following the Civil War. Most families survived through subsistence farming, occasional mining work, and small-scale timber operations. Schools were rare and poorly funded, usually one-room buildings maintained by the local community rather than any government entity. She found records indicating that Pine Ridge had been a small settlement about 12 miles northeast of the county seat. The community had existed from the 1870s through the early 1900s before being gradually abandoned as younger generations moved to cities seeking industrial jobs. The schoolhouse had burned down in 1903, and little physical evidence of the community remained today. Elijah Thorne proved even more elusive. Sarah discovered that he had been born in Richmond in 1857, apprenticed with a photographer there in his youth, then apparently left civilization behind to wander the mountain communities. A few scattered references in local newspapers mentioned his presence at county fairs or church gatherings where he offered photographic services. But unlike many photographers of his era who maintained studios and advertised regularly, Thorne seemed to have operated informally, moving from town to town with his equipment loaded onto a wagon. The most intriguing detail came from a brief diary entry Sarah found in the digital archives of the Virginia Historical Society. A schoolteacher named Martha Weatherby, who taught in a neighboring county, had written in November 1890, "A photographer named Mr. Thorne visited today and made pictures of our pupils. He is a peculiar man, very particular about the positioning of everyone, and he took nearly 2 hours to arrange a single photograph. The children grew restless, but he insisted everything be perfect. He spoke often of making images that would tell the truth that eyes alone cannot see." That phrase haunted Sarah, "tell the truth that eyes alone cannot see." What had Thorne meant by that? Was he simply an artist trying to create meaningful compositions? Or had he developed some unusual photographic technique that produced these anomalous results? Sarah's phone rang. It was Marcus. "You need to come back to the lab," he said without preamble. "I've found something, and it's going to change everything we thought we knew about this photograph." Sarah arrived at Marcus's laboratory within an hour, her mind racing with possibilities. She found him standing before a large monitor displaying multiple views of the Pine Ridge School photograph, each processed through different analytical filters. "I've spent the last week analyzing every aspect of this image," Marcus began, gesturing toward the screen. "And I can now confirm several things with absolute certainty. First, this is definitely an authentic 1890s photograph. The chemistry, the paper, the degradation patterns, everything checks out. Second, this is definitely a single exposure, not a composite or double exposure. And third, the shadow anomaly is real and was present in the original negative." "Then how is it possible?" Sarah asked. Marcus pulled up another image on the screen. "Let me show you something." I examined the photograph under different wavelengths of light, including infrared and ultraviolet. Under UV light, I found something extraordinary. He displayed what looked like the same photograph, but with strange variations in tone and texture. "Do you see these areas here?" He pointed to sections of the ground surrounding the children. The UV analysis reveals that certain areas of the photographic emulsion have been selectively altered. "Altered how?" "Someone, almost certainly the photographer himself, manually retouched specific portions of the negative after it was developed but before any prints were made. This was a known technique in the 1890s, often used to remove blemishes or enhance certain details. But Thorne did something far more sophisticated. He selectively modified the shadow areas to make them appear to fall in a direction different from where they naturally occurred." Sarah stared at the screen, trying to process this information. But why would he do that? What possible purpose could it serve? That's where it gets even more interesting. Marcus pulled up another document on his computer. "I reached out to colleagues in Appalachian studies and asked if they'd heard of Elijah Thorne. One researcher sent me a reference to a collection of letters held by a small historical society in Abingdon, Virginia. I contacted them, and they scanned and emailed me 3 letters written by Thorne to a friend in Richmond. Listen to this." Marcus began reading from one of the letters. "My dear William, I have discovered in my mountain travels that the camera can be more than a mere recording device. Through careful manipulation of the final image, I can embed within the photograph markers and signs that communicate truths which society refuses to acknowledge openly. The shadows I alter serve as a code, visible to those who know where to look, revealing situations that demand intervention but which cannot be spoken of directly without bringing harm to the vulnerable." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. A code? He was encoding information into the photographs. "It appears so." The letter continues. "I have documented 12 schoolhouses now, and in 3 of them I have found conditions that require the attention of authorities but which the local community either cannot or will not address. By altering the shadows in specific patterns, I create a visual signal that will alert charitable organizations and reform societies when they view these images, without alerting those who might retaliate against children or families who speak out." What conditions was he referring to? Sarah asked, though she already suspected the answer. Marcus looked uncomfortable. Given the era and the context, probably abuse, neglect, or dangerous living conditions. The 1890s were a time when child welfare laws barely existed, especially in isolated rural areas. Thorne seems to have appointed himself a kind of secret advocate, using his photography as a tool for covert activism. Sarah sat down heavily in a nearby chair. So the Pine Ridge School photograph, the one with the impossible shadows, might be trying to tell us something terrible was happening there. That's my conclusion. But here's the problem. We have no way of knowing what his specific code meant. Did the direction of the shadows indicate the type of problem? The severity? Specific individuals involved? Without more examples of his work or a key to his system, we're looking at a message we can't decipher. We need to find more of his photographs, Sarah said immediately. And we need to research what actually happened at Pine Ridge School. If he was documenting a real situation, there might be historical records, newspaper articles, court documents, something that tells us what was going on there in 1890. Over the next month, Sarah and Marcus divided their efforts. Marcus contacted museums, archives, and historical societies across Virginia, North Carolina, and West Virginia, searching for any other photographs by Elijah Thorne. Sarah traveled to Wythe County to examine local records in person. The drive from Washington to rural Retreat, Virginia, took Sarah through increasingly mountainous terrain. The interstate gave way to winding two-lane highways that climbed through dense forests and past small towns that seemed frozen in time. She had arranged to meet with Harold Dockery, a 73-year-old retired teacher who served as the volunteer curator of the Wythe County Historical Society. She found Harold in a converted storefront on Main Street, surrounded by filing cabinets, cardboard boxes, and shelves lined with old ledgers and documents. He was a thin man with kind eyes and hands weathered by decades of outdoor work before his teaching career. When Sarah called ahead to explain her research, Harold had expressed enthusiasm about her project and promised to pull whatever records he could find related to Pine Ridge. "The thing you have to understand about Pine Ridge," Harold explained as he led Sarah to a table covered with materials, "is that it was even more isolated than most mountain communities. The settlement sat in a narrow valley surrounded by steep ridges, accessible only by a single rough road. Most families there were related to each other, descendants of the original settlers who'd moved there in the 1830s. They didn't much trust outsiders, and they handled their own affairs without involving county authorities unless absolutely necessary." "What can you tell me about the school?" Sarah asked. Harold opened a ledger book. County records show that Pine Ridge School operated from 1878 to 1902. It was typical for the era: one teacher, all grades together, maybe 20 to 30 students depending on the year. Families paid the teacher directly rather than through taxes, usually in goods like food or firewood rather than money. The county's only involvement was certifying the teacher's credentials every few years. Who was teaching there in 1890? Harold ran his finger down a list of names. According to this, a man named Josiah Brennan. He started teaching there in 1887 and remained until 1892. Before that, he taught in Tazewell County. No record of where he went after leaving Pine Ridge. Is there anything unusual in the records about the school during those years? Complaints, investigations, anything? Harold shook his head. Nothing in the official documents. But that doesn't necessarily mean everything was fine. Problems in isolated communities often stayed hidden, especially if people were afraid or if local power structures protected certain individuals. What do you mean by local power structures? Well, in a place like Pine Ridge, you often had one or two families who owned most of the land and employed most of the men. If the schoolteacher was connected to those families, or if he was protected by them for some reason, nobody would dare complain even if something was wrong. Speaking up could mean losing your livelihood or even being forced out of the community entirely. Sarah spent 3 days in the Wythe County area, examining records, visiting the site where Pine Ridge had once stood, and talking to elderly residents whose grandparents had lived in the region. The schoolhouse location was now overgrown forest, with only a few moss-covered foundation stones indicating where buildings had once existed. Standing there in the mountain silence, Sarah tried to imagine those 30 children from the photograph, their faces bright with smiles that might have masked suffering. She discovered one particularly valuable source: the diary of Margaret Sutton, a woman who had lived in a neighboring community and occasionally visited Pine Ridge to trade goods with families there. Margaret's entries from late 1890 and early 1891 contained several references to Pine Ridge School and Josiah Brennan. November 18, 1890, visited Pine Ridge today to deliver eggs to the Claiborne family. Saw the school children walking home. They seemed quieter than usual, less boisterous. Mary Claiborne, who is 12, had bruises on her arms. When I asked if she had fallen, she looked frightened and would not answer. December 3, 1890, spoke with Susan Talbert at the church social. She mentioned that her nephew, who attends Pine Ridge School, no longer wants to go. He cries each morning and complains of stomach aches. Susan says the teacher is very strict, but she fears there may be more to it than discipline. January 15, 1891. There is talk in the community about Mr. Brennan, though no one speaks openly. The children at Pine Ridge have become withdrawn. Several families are considering keeping their children home, but they fear retaliation. Mr. Brennan boards with the Carter family, who own the largest tract of land in the valley. It is said that to cross Mr. Brennan is to cross the Carters, and that means ruin. Sarah photographed every page of the diary that mentioned Pine Ridge. When she returned to Washington, she immediately called Marcus. "I think I know what Thorne was documenting," she said, describing what she'd found. There was something wrong at that school, something involving the teacher. Families suspected it. Some children showed signs of abuse, but no one felt they could speak up. Thorne must have visited, taken the photograph, and realized what was happening. So he encoded a warning into the image by manipulating the shadows. "I have news too," Marcus replied. "I found 3 more of Thorne's photographs in a private collection in Charleston, West Virginia. 2 show normal shadows and appear to be straightforward school portraits. But the 3rd, from a school in McDowell County, shows the same shadow anomaly as the Pine Ridge image. And I did some research on that school. 6 months after Thorne's visit, the teacher there was arrested for assaulting students. It made the newspapers. The pieces were coming together, but one crucial element remained missing: what had actually happened at Pine Ridge. Had Thorne's encoded warning reached anyone who could act on it? And what had become of Josiah Brennan and the children in that photograph? Sarah's research entered a new phase as she focused intensely on the months following October 1890, when Elijah Thorne took the Pine Ridge School photograph. She needed to understand whether his coded warning had accomplished anything, and what had ultimately happened to the children and the teacher. She expanded her search to include newspapers from Richmond and other Virginia cities, reasoning that if a reform society or charitable organization had acted on Thorne's photograph, there might be some record of investigation or intervention. After days of searching through digitized newspaper archives, she found something in the February 12, 1891 edition of the Richmond Daily Dispatch. The article was brief, buried on page 7. County authorities investigate mountain school. Following concerns raised by a charitable organization regarding conditions at a rural school in Wythe County, officials have interviewed families and examined school facilities. The teacher, Mr. J. Brennan, has been dismissed pending further inquiry. Several families have reported disciplinary practices that exceeded appropriate bounds. The charitable organization, which received photographic evidence of concerning conditions, has called for stronger oversight of isolated schools throughout the mountain region. There was. Thorne's photograph had reached someone who understood the message. The encoded shadows had served their purpose. But Sarah needed more details. She contacted the Virginia State Archives and requested any documents related to school investigations in Wythe County during 1891. While waiting for those records, Sarah made another trip to Wythe County, this time armed with the names of families from the photograph. Harold Dockery had helped her identify some of the children by comparing the image to school enrollment records from 1890. She hoped to find descendants who might have heard family stories about that time. She located a woman named Beth and Fletcher, 68, whose great-grandfather had been one of the students in the photograph. Beth and lived in a neat farmhouse outside Rural Retreat, the walls decorated with old family photographs. When Sarah explained her research, Beth Ann's expression grew serious. "My great-grandfather was Thomas Fletcher," she said, pointing to a boy in the Pine Ridge photograph. "He rarely talked about his school days, but late in his life, after he'd had a stroke and was becoming forgetful, he mentioned some things to my grandmother. She wrote it down because she thought it might be important for the family to know." Beth Ann retrieved a small notebook from a desk drawer. "My grandmother wrote this in 1968, recording what her father told her. He was dying then, and I think he felt he could finally speak about it." She handed the notebook to Sarah. The entry read, "Daddy talked today about his teacher at Pine Ridge School, Mr. Brennan. He said that Mr. Brennan was cruel to the children, especially the boys. He would beat them with a leather strap for small mistakes, and sometimes he would lock children in the schoolhouse shed for hours as punishment. Daddy said that several children suffered broken bones or serious bruises, but families were afraid to complain because Mr. Brennan was protected by the Carter family, who controlled most of the work in the valley. Daddy remembered a photographer who came to the school in the fall of 1890. The photographer arranged everyone very carefully and told them all to smile and look happy, even though none of them felt happy. Daddy said he understood years later that the photographer had been trying to help them in some way, though he never knew exactly how. After the photographer's visit, investigators came to Pine Ridge and Mr. Brennan was forced to leave. Daddy believed the photographer had somehow alerted authorities, and he always felt grateful to that man, though he never learned his name. Sarah felt emotion welling up as she read the words. Thorne's efforts had succeeded. The children had been protected. "Do you know what happened to the other children in the photograph?" she asked Beth, and most of them stayed in the area, married, had families. A few moved away. They all lived normal lives, though I imagine they carried scars from their experience. My great-grandfather became a farmer and was known as a kind man who never raised his voice to children. I think his experience with Mr. Brennan shaped how he treated others. Sarah returned to Washington with a deeper understanding of the photograph's meaning, but she still wanted to find Elijah Thorne's own account of the situation. She contacted archives across Virginia, searching for any personal papers, diaries, or correspondence that might have survived. Her breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A rare book dealer in Baltimore contacted her after hearing about her research through professional networks. He had recently acquired a collection of letters and documents from an estate sale, including a leather-bound journal that had belonged to Elijah Thorne. The dealer, recognizing the historical significance, offered to sell it to the Smithsonian at a fair price rather than auctioning it to the highest bidder. Sarah met with the dealer and examined the journal. It covered the years 1889 through 1891 and contained detailed entries about Thorne's travels through the mountains. His writing revealed a thoughtful, observant man deeply troubled by the poverty and occasional cruelty he witnessed. The entry for October 23, 1890, described his visit to Pine Ridge School. Arrived at Pine Ridge this morning after a difficult journey along rutted mountain roads. The schoolhouse sits in a narrow valley, a rough building that shows the poverty of this community. I was greeted by the teacher, Mr. Josiah Brennan, a tall man with cold eyes and a manner that immediately put me ill at ease. The children assembled for the photograph appeared subdued, lacking the natural energy I have observed in other schools. Several bore visible marks on their arms and faces, which Mr. Brennan explained away as the result of farm work and rough play. As I prepared my equipment, I observed Mr. Brennan's interactions with the students. His voice was harsh, his manner threatening. When one small boy dropped his slate, Mr. Brennan grabbed him roughly by the shoulder and shook him. The child's face went pale with fear. The other children watched in silence, and I understood immediately that this was not an isolated incident. I arranged the children for the photograph, taking great care with their positioning. Mr. Brennan stood to one side, and I made certain his shadow would fall naturally. But for the children, I had a different plan. I have developed a technique whereby I can mark the negative after development, altering specific shadow patterns. These alterations serve as a code that I have shared with several reform societies and charitable organizations in Richmond. A shadow pattern that contradicts natural light indicates a situation requiring investigation. The children smiled for my camera because I asked them to, but I could see the sadness and fear behind those smiles. After I departed Pine Ridge, I traveled directly to Rural Retreat and posted this negative to the Virginia Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, along with a letter explaining what I observed. I can only hope they will act swiftly. Sarah sat in the Smithsonian Archive reading room, tears streaming down her face as she read Thorne's words. This man, working alone in the 1890s with limited resources and no official authority, had created an ingenious system to protect vulnerable children. He had understood that direct accusations might be dismissed or might endanger the accusers, so he had developed a covert method of alerting those who could help. She continued reading through the journal. A later entry from March 1891 revealed Thorne's satisfaction at learning that authorities had removed Josiah Brennan from Pine Ridge School and that several families had come forward with accounts of abuse once they understood they would be protected. Brennan had left Virginia, and no school would hire him after word spread about the investigation. But the journal also revealed Thorne's growing frustration with the limitations of his method. He wrote about other schools where he suspected problems but couldn't gather enough evidence to justify encoding a warning. He expressed despair at the scale of child suffering in isolated communities and his inability to reach everyone who needed help. The final entry in the journal was dated November 15, 1891. I have decided to end my mountain travels. The work has taken a toll on my health and spirit. I have documented 23 schools, and in 5 of them I found conditions serious enough to warrant my coded warnings. All 5 have since been investigated, and changes have been made. I consider this a meaningful accomplishment, though I am haunted by the schools where I suspected problems but could not prove them, and by all the children in isolated places I never reached at all. I am returning to Richmond to establish a proper photographic studio. Perhaps from a fixed location I can continue to advocate for reform, though in more conventional ways. I have shared my shadow alteration technique with colleagues in the reform movement, and I hope others will use it if needed. Photography has the power not just to record reality but to speak truths that cannot be spoken aloud. This will always be my belief. Sarah closed the journal carefully. She now understood the complete story behind the Pine Ridge School photograph. Elijah Thorne had seen children in danger, documented their situation through a coded image, and successfully alerted authorities who intervened. The impossible shadows were not a mystery or an anomaly, they were a deliberate message of protection sent across more than a century. But one question remained. What had become of Elijah Thorne himself? Sarah searched for records of his life after 1891. She found a business listing for E. Thorne Photography in Richmond directories from 1892 to 1907. A brief obituary from 1908 revealed that he had died at age 51 from pneumonia, leaving behind a modest estate and a reputation as a skilled but eccentric photographer who often donated his services to charitable organizations. Marcus had completed his technical analysis of all 4 Thorne photographs they had located. The 2 with normal shadows dated from schools where subsequent research revealed no reports of problems. The 2 with altered shadows both corresponded to schools where abuse was later documented and addressed. Thorne's system had been consistent and effective. "We need to publish this research," Marcus told Sarah during a meeting at his laboratory. "This is an important discovery not just for photographic history but for understanding how social reform happened in the 19th century. Thorne was an innovative activist who used his professional skills to protect vulnerable people." "I agree," Sarah replied. "But I want to make sure we tell the story responsibly. Those children in the photograph deserve to be remembered not just as victims but as survivors. And Thorne deserves recognition for his courage and creativity." Sarah spent the next 3 months writing a comprehensive article for the Journal of American History, detailing the discovery of Thorne's photographs, the shadow code he had developed, and the successful interventions that resulted from his work. She included analysis of the social context, explaining why direct reporting of abuse was so difficult in isolated Appalachian communities and how Thorne's indirect method had overcome those barriers. The article attracted significant attention when published. News outlets picked up the story, fascinated by the combination of photographic mystery and social activism. Several museums requested to display the Pine Ridge School photograph along with explanatory materials about Thorne's technique and the historical context. But the most meaningful response came from descendants of the children in the photograph. Beth and Fletcher contacted Sarah to say that her family wanted to thank her for uncovering the truth about the photographer who had helped their great-grandfather. Other descendants reached out as well, sharing family stories about the children in the image and expressing gratitude that their ancestors' experience was finally being understood and validated. Sarah arranged for a small gathering in Wythe County, bringing together as many descendants as she could locate. They met at the County Historical Society, where Harold Dockery had prepared a display featuring the Pine Ridge School photograph alongside historical documents and family histories. About 40 people attended, ranging from elderly individuals who had known the photographed children in their old age to young children who represented the 5th generation descended from those students. Sarah gave a presentation explaining Elijah Thorne's work and the meaning of the shadow code. She watched as people studied the photograph, seeing it now not as a simple school portrait but as a message of protection that had traveled through time to reveal both suffering and courage. An elderly man named Robert Sutton stood to speak. "My grandfather was Daniel Sutton, one of the boys in this photograph. He told me once, when I was young, that a man with a camera had saved him and his classmates from a bad situation. I didn't understand what he meant then, but now I do. That photographer saw what was happening, and he found a way to help when others couldn't or wouldn't. My grandfather lived to be 87 years old, married my grandmother, raised 5 children, and was the kindest man I ever knew. He had a good life, and part of the reason was because somebody cared enough to act when he was just a frightened child. So I want to say thank you to Dr. Mitchell for finding this story, and thank you to Mr. Thorne, wherever he is, for being the kind of person who helps. The room erupted in applause, and Sarah felt the weight of the past months of research transform into something deeply meaningful. This wasn't just an academic project or a historical curiosity. It was about real people, real suffering, and real heroism. 6 months after publishing her article, Sarah received an unexpected email from a woman named Jennifer Caldwell in Asheville, North Carolina. Jennifer explained that she was a photographer working with a nonprofit organization focused on child welfare in rural communities. She had read Sarah's article about Elijah Thorne and was inspired by his use of photography as a tool for advocacy. "I've been thinking about how we might adapt Thorne's approach to modern contexts," Jennifer wrote. "Obviously, we don't need shadow codes anymore. We can report concerns directly to authorities. But there's something powerful about the idea of photographers being actively engaged in protecting vulnerable people rather than just documenting situations. I'd love to discuss this with you if you're interested." Sarah agreed to meet with Jennifer, and they spent an afternoon in a coffee shop in Asheville discussing the intersection of photography, documentary work, and social activism. Jennifer described her organization's work in rural Appalachian communities, many of which still faced issues of poverty, isolation, and limited access to services. "We work with schools, community centers, and families," Jennifer explained. "Part of what we do is create photographic documentation of community life, both to celebrate the positive aspects of these places and to identify areas where support is needed. But we're always careful about ethics, about not exploiting people's struggles, about making sure our work actually benefits the communities rather than just providing dramatic images for donors." "That's exactly the balance Thorne was trying to strike," Sarah observed. "He wanted to help without exposing people to more harm, without turning their suffering into spectacle. His shadow code was a way of communicating necessary information to those who could act on it without broadcasting it to everyone." Their conversation led to a collaborative project. Sarah would develop a historical exhibition about Elijah Thorne and 19th century child welfare reform, while Jennifer's organization would create a parallel modern photography initiative focused on child well-being in Appalachian communities. The two projects would be presented together, showing how past and present connected through the common thread of using photography to promote positive change. Sarah returned to the Smithsonian and proposed the exhibition to her department director. The concept was approved, and she began the intensive work of curating Shadows of Protection, Elijah Thorne and the Art of Covert Advocacy. The exhibition would feature the 4 Thorne photographs they had discovered, along with his journal, the letters explaining his technique, and historical context about child welfare in the 1890s. But Sarah wanted the exhibition to go deeper. She reached out to archives across the Appalachian region, searching for any other examples of Thorne's work or similar efforts by other photographers. What she discovered surprised her. Several other photographers from the same era had also occasionally manipulated their images in subtle ways, embedding messages or markers that communicated with specific audiences. One photographer in Kentucky had used unusual framing to indicate schools where medical attention was urgently needed. Another in West Virginia had employed specific props, like flowers or books, positioned in coded arrangements to signal different types of community needs to charitable organizations. These photographers had formed an informal network, sharing techniques and coordinating their efforts to support isolated communities. "It wasn't just Thorne," Sarah told Marcus excitedly. "There was a whole movement of activist photographers working quietly to protect children and support vulnerable communities. They understood that sometimes direct advocacy wasn't possible or safe, so they developed creative methods of communication." Marcus helped Sarah authenticate and analyze these additional photographs, confirming that the manipulations or coded elements were genuine and intentional. The discovery expanded the scope of the exhibition significantly. It was no longer just about one man's innovative technique, but about a broader effort to use emerging technologies for social good. As Sarah worked on the exhibition, she also maintained contact with the descendants of the Pine Ridge school children. Beth and Fletcher became particularly involved, serving as a liaison to other families and helping Sarah understand the long-term impact of the intervention Thorne had facilitated. My great-grandfather's generation lived with the memory of what happened at that school, Beth and explained during one of their phone conversations. But they also lived with the knowledge that someone had cared enough to help them. I think that shaped how they viewed the world and how they treated others. My great-grandfather was active in his church, always helping families in need. Several of the other children in that photograph became teachers themselves, and they were known for being kind and protective of their students. In a way, Mr. Thorne's action created ripples that spread through generations. Sarah included these family perspectives in the exhibition, creating a section titled Living Legacy that traced the descendants of the Pine Ridge children and showed how the intervention of 1891 had influenced family values and community involvement for more than a century. The exhibition opened at the Smithsonian in September, attracting steady crowds and positive reviews. News coverage brought even more attention, and several documentary filmmakers expressed interest in creating longer-form content about Thorne's story. But the most touching moment came during the opening reception. A group of about 20 people arrived together, descendants of the Pine Ridge school children who had coordinated their travel to Washington for the event. They stood together in front of the large reproduction of the school photograph, some holding old family photos that showed the children from Thorne's image as elderly adults, their lives lived fully despite the difficult beginning. Robert Sutton spoke to the assembled crowd. "We're here to represent the children in this photograph, our ancestors who faced a difficult situation but were protected by a man they barely knew. Elijah Thorne took this picture 135 years ago, and he encoded a message in it that saved our grandparents and great-grandparents from continued suffering. Today, we honor him and we honor everyone who uses their skills and their courage to protect vulnerable people." This photograph isn't just history, it's a reminder that individuals can make a difference, that creativity and compassion can overcome obstacles, and that the effects of good actions can echo through time. The applause that followed was genuine and emotional. Sarah stood to the side, watching as visitors engaged with the exhibition, reading the explanatory panels, examining the photographs, and discussing the ethical questions raised by Thorne's work. She noticed children among the visitors, students brought by teachers to learn about history and social justice. One young girl, perhaps 10 years old, stood studying the Pine Ridge photograph for a long time. Finally, she turned to her teacher and asked, "Did this really work? Did the man with the camera really help those kids?" "Yes," the teacher replied. "He really did." "Good," the girl said firmly. "People should help when they see something wrong." Sarah smiled, recognizing that the exhibition was accomplishing exactly what she had hoped, connecting past and present, showing how individual action could create meaningful change, and inspiring visitors to think about their own responsibilities to protect vulnerable people. Jennifer Caldwell's Parallel Project was also making progress. Her organization had launched a photography initiative in 6 Appalachian counties, training community members to document local life and identify needs. The photographs were used to secure funding for after-school programs, medical services, and educational resources. Unlike Thorne's era, the documentation could be direct and transparent, but the underlying principle remained the same: photography as a tool for positive change rather than mere observation. In December, Sarah and Jennifer organized a joint symposium at Georgetown University, bringing together historians, photographers, social workers, and community activists to discuss the legacy of activist photography. The conversations were rich and complex, addressing both the successes of past efforts and the ongoing challenges of using visual media ethically in vulnerable communities. One presenter, a documentary photographer who had worked in Appalachia for 30 years, raised a critical point. Thorne's shadow code worked because he had relationships with reform organizations that understood the code and could act on the information. Today, we have different tools and different systems, but the principle remains crucial. Documentation alone doesn't create change. You need connections, you need people ready to respond, and you need to ensure that your work doesn't create additional risks for the people you're trying to help." Sarah nodded, appreciating the complexity of the discussion. Thorne's story was inspiring, but it also raised difficult questions about responsibility, intervention, and the limits of what outsiders could or should do in communities not their own. After the symposium, Sarah sat in her office at the Smithsonian, looking at the Pine Ridge School photograph displayed on her wall. She had lived with this image for more than a year now, and it had transformed from a mysterious anomaly into a deeply meaningful artifact that represented courage, creativity, and compassion. Her phone rang. It was Harold Dockery from the Wythe County Historical Society. "Sarah, I wanted to let you know that we've received funding to create a permanent exhibit about Pine Ridge School and Elijah Thorne at our museum. We'll be able to tell the story locally, where it happened, and we're planning to restore the site where the schoolhouse stood. Nothing elaborate, just a small memorial marker explaining what happened there and how it was addressed. We think it's important for people to know that this community faced a problem and that intervention made a difference." "That's wonderful, Harold. The descendants will be pleased." "They are. Several families are contributing to the project. And here's the interesting part. We've been contacted by descendants of the Carter family, the ones who protected Josiah Brennan initially. They want to make a donation to the Memorial Fund as a way of acknowledging their ancestors' role in allowing the abuse to continue. They say it's important for their family to own that history and to support efforts to prevent similar situations today." Sarah was moved by this gesture of accountability. That takes real courage, to acknowledge difficult family history like that. It does. But I think that's part of what makes this story important. It's not just about heroes and villains. It's about how communities can enable harm through silence and complicity, and how breaking that silence requires both courage and creative approaches. Thorne found a way to break the silence when direct methods weren't possible. That's worth remembering. After the call ended, Sarah sat quietly, reflecting on the journey this research had taken her on. She had started with a simple observation about impossible shadows and had uncovered a story about human courage, suffering, intervention, and healing that spanned more than a century. The Pine Ridge School children had grown up, lived full lives, raised families, and passed on values of kindness and protection that shaped subsequent generations. Elijah Thorne had lived modestly, never receiving public recognition for his innovative activism, but his actions had created lasting positive change. The reform societies he worked with had helped establish stronger child welfare systems. And now, in the present day, photographers and activists continued the work of using visual media to identify needs and promote well-being. Sarah opened her laptop and began drafting a new article, this one focused on the broader network of activist photographers she had discovered. She wanted to document their techniques, their motivations, and their impact. But more than that, she wanted to explore the question of how creative individuals could use their professional skills to address social problems, even when direct advocacy was difficult or dangerous. As she wrote, she thought about the young girl at the exhibition who had asked if Thorne's efforts really worked. The answer was yes, but it was more complicated than a simple success story. Thorne had helped one group of children in one school, but he couldn't reach everyone. The problems he addressed, poverty, isolation, abuse, limited resources, still existed in various forms today. His story wasn't a fairy tale with a perfect ending. It was a real human story about imperfect efforts to create positive change in an imperfect world. But that made it more valuable, not less. Real change came from sustained effort, from many people working in different ways toward common goals, from learning from both successes and failures. Thorne's shadow code had been one small innovation in a much larger struggle for child welfare and social justice. A struggle that continued into the present and would continue into the future. Sarah finished her draft and saved the file. She glanced once more at the Pine Ridge School photograph on her wall, at the smiling faces of children who had been frightened and suffering but who had been seen, documented, and ultimately protected. The impossible shadows had told a story that needed to be told, had delivered a message across time and space that had saved lives and influenced generations. Sometimes, Sarah thought, the most important truths are the ones that require creative methods to communicate. Sometimes the most valuable messages are the ones carefully encoded for those who know how to read them. And sometimes a single photograph, properly understood, can reveal depths of human experience that words alone cannot express. The afternoon light slanted through her office window, casting natural shadows across her desk. Sarah smiled, thinking how Elijah Thorne would have appreciated the irony. After all her research into manipulated shadows, she found herself comforted by ordinary shadows falling exactly where physics dictated they should fall. But she also understood that those manipulated shadows from 1890 had been necessary, had been purposeful, had been an act of protection disguised as an optical impossibility. In documenting them, in telling their story, Sarah had honored not just Elijah Thorne but all the people throughout history who had found creative ways to speak truth, protect the vulnerable, and resist injustice. The Pine Ridge school children had been photographed on an October day in 1890, their shadows falling in impossible directions. 135 years later, their image still spoke, still taught, still reminded viewers that seeing clearly sometimes requires looking beyond the obvious, beyond the expected, to find the truth that someone carefully encoded for those willing to search for it.